Welcome to those of you who are there. I'm afraid I can't see you right at the moment, but thank you very much for joining us. And also those people who are present in the room for this session on open research initiatives at Maynooth University. And we have 4 presentations today. The first one, which I'll talk about in a minute, QSA Net on promoting open research in qualitative social science. The second one is on TROPIC, which Dermot will introduce to you, and then also Ian Marder will talk about his project. And those 3 projects are all projects which are funded under the National Open Research Forum Stimulus Fund for open open science, for promoting open science. And then the 4th presentation will be by Fran Callahan from Maynooth University Library about the Irish Qualitative Data Archive. But Fran is also, I know, very active across many of these North projects. So I think all of the thing that brings them all together is that they've all been inspired and funded and promoted by the agenda for open research that is under the auspices of North. So the background to our own project, QSA Net, is that this one is funded under the North Open Research Stimulus Fund 2023. And just to provide some background to all of the projects here, North is designed to promote and to implement the National Action Plan for Open Research, which adopts the UNESCO definition of open research, including the principles of making scientific knowledge openly available, increasing collaboration and sharing, and opening the process of knowledge creation beyond the traditional scientific community. Now, the QSA Net project addresses Theme 3 within the Open Research Plan, which involves making research data fair. That is, trying to ensure that data conform to the FAIR research principles. FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And I think a lot of the emphasis on the FAIR data principles is about ensuring that the data are there and potentially available for others to reuse. What QSA Net targets is what actually promotes reuse. So if the ultimate goal of FAIR is to optimize the reuse of data, how can we encourage people, particularly in the qualitative social sciences, to actually access and reuse data? So that's the agenda for QSA Net. So within qualitative social science, there was a long and extended debate about whether or not it was feasible or appropriate to archive qualitative data, to make it available to others. To some extent, the debate is over, although I would say there is still, particularly in the Irish context, a lot of concern about some of the challenges associated with archiving data. But internationally, the debate has kind of moved on to trying to develop qualitative secondary analysis as a distinctive method. And these are just 2 of the books that have been published in the United Kingdom on qualitative secondary analysis in recent times. I was involved in part in establishing the Irish Qualitative Data Archive, and as part of the work for that project, we conducted a consultation with researchers about their thoughts about archiving data, and you can find a review of researchers' perspectives dating from that period, the early 2000s, in Garrity 2014. So just to tell you a little bit about QSA Net and what we're hoping to do. So we have 3 interconnected goals within this project. We want to develop skills in qualitative secondary analysis amongst Irish researchers at different stages of their career and within different fields, including cross-sectoral researchers, that is, researchers who may be engaged in practice of one kind of or another outside the traditional academic environment. We want to promote expertise and innovation in qualitative secondary analysis. So we want to engage with this international movement towards developing QSA as a distinctive methodology. And we want to build national and international community. So in order to do that, what we are beginning to do now, the first stage of the work is to conduct focus groups, and Bao, who was the postdoctoral researcher on the project, and myself were talking this morning about how it's probably better to describe this as a kind of consultation exercise. So we're trying to engage in group discussions with different communities of researchers to learn about their understanding of qualitative secondary analysis, what barriers there might be to reusing qualitative data, and what kinds of training resources they might need to do so. So we want to talk to cross-disciplinary researchers, cross-sectoral researchers. We would also like to talk to those who teach research methods trainings in the academy. And are they prepared? Do they know enough about the availability of qualitative data to train the next generation of researchers in qualitative secondary analysis? And we would also like to talk to research funders to learn a bit about, what they know about, sort of, for example, peer reviewers' responses to proposals, including qualitative secondary analysis, what their approach or understanding to it might be. And following on from that consultation, we want to develop tailored training workshops for each of these groups, and to develop training resources which will be open access, available in the Digital Repository of Ireland, and also we hope in the National Centre for Research Methods platform in the UK. We will of course deposit the data that we collect as part of the research in the Irish Qualitative Data Archive. So finally, the third interlinked stage of this process is we want to build a community of researchers both in Ireland and to contribute to the ongoing development of international networks of researchers in the field of qualitative data analysis. So we are hoping to conduct an in-person interim workshop. We want to create a study group in the Sociology of Association of Ireland professional organization for sociologists, and we also want to participate in an online international workshop which has been initiated at the University of Leeds to try to develop this international network of researchers interested in QSA. I'm nearly finished. I asked Bal to keep an eye on the time for me. So why is this important? Well, this is me on my soapbox actually, rather than anything to do with the project. But I think qualitative social science, particularly social science based on interviews, is potentially in trouble. Research by information scientists has found that even though there is an increased volume of qualitative research being used, its impact in terms of citations, in terms of how it's evaluated, for example, in exercises like the RED in the UK has gone down. So lots of people are doing qualitative research, especially interviews, but the prestige or status or impact of that kind of work is potentially deteriorating. There is also a continued emphasis on quantifiable research targets. So for example, if you look at the HEA system performance framework, which has this dashboard, it's a dashboard of quantifiable metrics, including citations inside and things like that. Again, even though there's lip service paid to the importance of qualitative measurement within the field, for example, as arising from the DORA initiative, amongst others, nevertheless, the trend is very much towards quantitative metrics. And even among social scientists, there is those of you, probably nobody here is old enough to remember, but there used to be this thing called the paradigm wars in social science between qualitative versus quantitative, and it was seen as these kind of two completely different paradigms for understanding social life. And it was very bitter and very, argumentative at the time. And then it seemed to resolve itself. It seemed to disappear. We reached the stage where everybody agreed that there's a place for both quantitative and qualitative. And of course, a lot of lip service as well paid towards mixed methods. But increasingly, I'm noticing in the literature a pushback again from quantitative researchers against qualitative social science. So there was a recent, I saw it in a blog post, but it started on Twitter, a recent debate about an article that was published in a quite high prestige journal, but which was challenged by quantitative researchers on the grounds that its scope was too narrow for the claims that were being made, which again is a sort of common kind of question that's placed towards qualitative researchers. But I'm saying all this because I think this is why I think it's really important for qualitative social science to continue on this journey of adopting open science principles, because we don't actually have anything to hide or be afraid of. And I think in order to improve the impact and the value of qualitative social science within the field, this is a path that we continue to follow. So I'm just going to conclude. The research team at Maynooth are myself and Rong Bao. We have two project partners, Lisa Moran at the Technological University of the Shannon and Karen Hughes at the University of Leeds. And she's also director of the Timescapes Archive, which was one of the leading international archives for qualitative data. These are our project affiliates. I'm not going to go through them all, but you can see Fran Callahan right at the top there, and Dermot also. The references are there on the slides as well, which will be available afterwards for people to view if they're interested. So thank you very much for that. What do I do now? I think that we kind of agreed that it would be better to go through the presentations first, and each person is going to introduce themselves, and then we'll hopefully, some of you will still be there, and we will have questions afterwards.
Okay, thanks everyone, and thank you, Jane, for that. So I'm going to be talking about the Training for Open Research in an Irish Context project, and the lead researcher in this is Dunia Laksoon, who can't be here today, but she contributed some slides, for which I'm very grateful. I'm going to fly through this stuff at pace, because we've only got 10 minutes. And I'm going to say how it started for me in terms of my open research journey, how it's going for research generally, and then looking to the future and developing training to meet our needs. So about 12 years ago, I was involved in trying to replicate a study in the area of embodied cognition. I'm not going to share the details. They're not important for the current purposes. And the study we were trying to replicate was published in Science, high impact journal. It's been cited over 2,000 times. The original lead researcher, he has been cited over 100,000 times. So it created huge impact. And we wanted to build on this research and develop new studies and go from there. And the original study had this effect. It doesn't really matter how important it is, but you can see it's well above the 0 line at the bottom. And we replicated the study in 3 different areas in Michigan, Ohio, and Manchester. So if we were able to successfully replicate it, the effects should look something like this. But when we collected our data in Michigan, it did not look like that. In Ohio, it did not look like that. In fact, in the opposite direction. In Manchester, it did not look like that. And overall, it really did not look like that. And this really blew my mind. Like, it really shook my faith. You know, how can it be that a study is published in one of the most prestigious journals out there, and it simply doesn't work? It can't be replicated. What is going on there? And this kind of was foreshadowed by a paper in 2005 by John Ioannidis, who had the provocative title of Why Most Published Research Findings Are False. This paper is not without its own problems, but basically he said that we see excessive significant results in kind of empirical studies, and this is due to researchers' flexibility in how they analyze data, small sample sizes, publication bias, so not publishing negative or no results, and the general need for people to find significant results in order to be published. So it's very difficult to know what you can trust out there in the literature. You're basically left in a situation where you have to take researchers' word for it. What they say, what they claim in the paper, that's all you can go on. There's nothing there to allow you to verify independently the claims they've made. And then, so what happens when you try to systematically replicate findings in any given discipline? Well, the picture isn't particularly rosy. In psychology, they had the open science collaboration that had a 60% failure to replicate studies in the top empirical journals in psychology. Now, some people will say psychology is not a real science, so you can ignore that. Then we look at cancer cell biology, which is certainly a hard science, a 90% failure rate. They tried to do that again more recently, and it didn't improve very much. Cardiovascular health, a 75% failure rate. At this point, we were talking about life and death research. It's a huge impact on people's lives. And it's not just quantitative research as well. In areas of qualitative research, where there are kind of rigorous kind of reproducible methods that are being used when they tried to do researchers in the same domain, they had a 74% failure rate. So it's a very kind of consistent pattern, regardless of the area you look at. So when you try and look, say, across the social sciences, then in terms of what are people doing in terms of improving the openness and transparency of the research products, the picture isn't great either. So this is a paper from 2020 that paints a picture of basically no studies have been pre-registered, 7% open data, 11% open materials, and about 40% open access publications. Now, those figures have improved slightly, but not dramatically, and not to the level that we would want. But of course, I'm sure this is all going to work itself out. And when we look at the situation, it can feel kind of overwhelming in terms of like, how can we improve the situation, which is not good, to put it mildly. Because there are so many problems facing researchers and institutions, it's hard to know where to turn, and we can feel powerless. But one thing we can look at is training. So we can improve the information that's given to PhD students, early career researchers, and at least the next generation will be well set up to have transparent and reproducible research practices. And that's where the TROPIC project comes in. So the aims of the project, and again, this is funded by North as well, the aims were multiple, but initially we're focused on assessing training needs in Ireland. So we're specifically focused on the Irish context. You know, what do people know about open research? What are the gaps in knowledge? And then use this to build a tailored curriculum for people with the goal of upskilling researchers, so making it practical, and then ultimately creating a train the trainer network to sort of spread the burden of training the next generation of researchers. And so we wanted, we've engaged with representatives from across the Irish higher education landscape, from about a dozen institutions in Ireland. We've also had collaborations with the UK Reproducibility Network. And to start us off, we wanted to assess researchers' awareness and needs. So we wanted to engage with early career researchers, PhD students, all the way up to senior professors, and we wanted to take in humanities, social sciences, and sciences. So humanities is often under-investigated in terms of open research practices. So we really wanted to make sure we covered that as well. So we conducted a survey of over 300 respondents in Irish higher education, and that includes researchers, but also research support staff and librarians, and ranging in rank from PhD students all the way up to senior professors. And you see all the different disciplines we've covered here. So we had coverage from the humanities, but again, it's underrepresented, even with, you know, really trying to encourage respondents from these disciplines. So what we wanted to find out was basically how aware people were of these various open research practices and to what extent they were implementing them in their own research workflows. And actually, the picture was pretty positive when we look at awareness levels that people had. So people, not surprisingly, very aware of open access publications, open data, things like this, but less so when it comes to registered reports, study pre-registration, or open peer review. Probably the most striking thing, though, is when we asked people the extent to which they were implementing these practices in their own research, we noticed a massive awareness engagement gap. So there was a huge drop-off in terms of people actually implementing these. So this is going to be a big challenge. It's not enough that people know these practices are out there. They've got to implement them in their research as well. Other things that we found from the survey were that we found large differences in across the practice as well. So it was going from like 98% down to, you know, 20, 30%. Differences by methodology and discipline as well. So as alluded to by Jane, we often see that qualitative researchers are less engaged in open research practices, and we also see some disciplines are less engaged as well. So we need to address this kind of head on. We also identified a number of barriers that people highlight, including lack of financial support. Who's going to pay to convert my videos and store them and upload them so that they'll be there in 25 years' time? People don't have the time to actually do this. All of this takes extra time. There's a lack of incentive. It doesn't contribute to your employment status, to your promotion, so why should you bother doing it? And there's a general lack of recognition. There, as far as I know, in Ireland, there are no prizes for open research, whereas in other countries there are. But the surprising thing was that researchers are, by and large, massively positive about doing open research. So almost 90% of people wanted to receive additional training. So this is something to be really positive about. So what we want to do is focus on this, dealing with this awareness engagement gap. We also want to focus on improving skills in qualitative research, open practices in that domain, and Jane's project also addresses this issue, and also consider unique disciplinary challenges. So we don't have all the answers. So what we want to do is foster a kind of bottom-up approach to give people the skills to identify what they can do in their own domains. And helpfully, the UK Reproducibility Network has dozens of case studies that address everything from archaeology and classics to law, history, engineering that we can draw on, where we see experts, established professors and leaders in these domains showing how they are implementing open research practices in their own work. So just to wrap up, researchers face huge problems in making their work open. So we need to focus on providing them with the skills and the opportunities and bridging this awareness engagement gap, promoting open research practices across methodologies and disciplines, and generally advocating for open research transparency and reproducibility. And there's our details there. I will stop there. Thank you.
That's really good. Yes.
Okay, and you can see that online. It hasn't come up for me on the online bit.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, great. Well, look, thank you very much for inviting me to contribute to the session on open research. As Jane said before, I got one of these NORF grants with a number of colleagues, including research assistant on the project, Patrice, who couldn't be with us today, but I'm presenting on our behalf. And I'm going to kind of make two arguments today as part of this. One is the need to recognize what we call research translation as an open research practice. And then secondly, the role of partnerships, research policy practice partnerships in contributing to research translation, and indeed the importance of the structure of those partnerships, because you might be able to do research translation without a partnership, but not any research translation activity will result in impact. And you might be able to do partnerships in ways that are intuitive or unstructured or structured in certain ways. But I would propose that the more we think about the structure and the more we are intentional in what we are doing with that structure, the more benefit there is to the partnership work in particular. And I highly recommend a paper on policy engagement that was recently circulated by our colleague Sean O'Folu, who's on secondment to us, by Catherine Oliver, who did a big, I believe, systematic review of efforts at research policy engagement, and found that very few of those efforts are evaluated, and those that were evaluated suggested there was very little impact. So what I'm trying to think about is, the need for research translation that is effective, how it fits into the open research framework, and how you can do that in an effective way. So the problem is that these big social issues require, I suggest, researchers, policymakers, and practitioners to practice differently, to do their work differently. For researchers, this means that at least some of us must be involved in co-creating and implementing knowledge to enable policy and practice that meets people's needs. And I say some of us because, there are colleagues of ours, we don't all need to be doing the same thing, right? There are colleagues of ours in my department, law, people do doctrinal work, people do more philosophical work or historical work. And that's, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, we absolutely need that, right? But I do think that we need to think about how we might contribute to policy and practice that meets people's needs. But the question I ask first is, why is this relevant to open research? Because I would suggest that the overwhelming majority of open research conversations talk about things like the things that Dermot and Jane were talking about in terms of open access, open data, and so on. But going back to the UNESCO definition that Ireland adopted, I highlight 2 points here: increasing sharing of information for the benefit of science and society, and opening the processes of scientific knowledge creation, evaluation, and communication to actors beyond the community. So it's not just about the things that we as academics do when we're doing our normal practices and when we're talking to each other, but also the extent to which we're engaging with people beyond the academy. And research translation is that process of engaging beyond the academy for the purpose of having more evidence-informed policy and practice. I use, in my discipline, George Pesta wrote about translational criminology, is the sub-discipline, right? This is a discipline in itself of working out how knowledge is created through research and then used to inform policy and practice in criminal justice. So the theme within North that we are trying to attend to is the one around embedding a culture of open research. And so our project aims to embed a culture of interdisciplinary open research in criminal justice through a thematic partnership. The theme, of course, is criminal justice, as I say. And what we're looking at is methods of structuring that partnership work to maximize the potential benefits of it. And that might be also replicated if it, to the extent that it was effective. And we're going to evaluate that soon, hopefully, but it might be replicated in other countries and policy areas. So the Criminal Justice Open Research Dialogue Partnership is what we call an R3P, a researcher, policymaker, practitioner partnership. And it has about 120 people involved from 53 organizations across multiple sectors: higher education, criminal justice, but within criminal justice, policy practice and oversight, as well as community sector, and, as I say, higher ed more broadly. It's for the entire jurisdiction. It is for the entire criminal justice process. And I mention that because, there are slightly similar things to this that exist, for example, in policing in other countries. Like there's a Scottish Institute of Policing Research that has some similarities to this. So, but we are not just nationwide, we're also for the entire criminal justice process. Research partners from all disciplines. So how can we apply knowledge from many areas to issues of crime and justice? There's not a lot of commitment required to join. So basically the only commitment is to be on our mailing list and to be invited to do things. So trying to have very low barriers to entry. As I mentioned, we have specific approaches, which I'll describe a little bit soon, and we're funded. For this initial period, we're really asking, on what can we agree? Can we agree as everyone working on a given theme across sectors, across disciplines, across professions within sectors, on what are the principles that we would have for working together on open research? How might we embed a culture of open research? What should the priorities be? What action should we take to engage in research translation? Those are the kind of questions that we're asking. Beautiful slide that one of my research assistants made recently with all the colorful logos. So just to throw in that, really the idea is to be as inclusive as possible in terms of the people involved, because it's not just that researchers, sometimes don't engage enough or in the optimal ways with policy and practice, but also within the policy and practice sectors in criminal justice. There's a lot of conversations that need to happen in all of those different directions as well. So what we've done in 2023-24 is a couple of things. One is a series of workshops where we've explored on what we can agree, and I'll tell you the structure for that momentarily. We also undertook a scoping review led by my colleague Patrice McCormack, where we were exploring criminal justice research partnerships in other countries. And so we're hopefully going to publish that soon. What you can see on the right-hand side was the output from our first workshop, where we sought to agree principles, purposes, and priorities, followed by an open authorship process. So that meant that we had an event prior to which we surveyed 70 people to ask them their answers to those questions. We drafted something up based on analysis of those answers, brought it to the event, undertook a process of discussion and feedback at the event, and then through a shared document, invited everyone to be a co-author on this thing. And the reason I put this here is because there are a lot of people from organizations on this that would not traditionally be involved in substantial amounts of academic research or necessarily put their name to academic papers, including criminal justice agencies like the Guards, Probation Service, the Irish Prison Service, and so on, but also criminal justice oversight bodies like the Inspector of Prison, and indeed thereon with some really important actors in the community justice sector and people from justice policy and across higher education. So as part of this scoping review, we found this article by Tillier and colleagues, who talked about success in research partnership development is predicated on at least three sources of influence: the researcher, the practitioner, and the process by which they interact. And so, as I say, one of the things we were really trying to do with this was almost to pilot a model, a structure of partnership development that if it were successful, it could be replicated elsewhere. And I'll only talk about this extremely briefly. But what we used was a combination of two practices. One is restorative approaches, restorative practice, and the other one is design thinking. These are both things that there's a lot of experience of this within Maynooth University, and they're both kind of gaining increasing, I suppose, salience in Ireland generally. But, we've all organized events, and it's very difficult to know how to make the most of the time spent together in the room. And that's what we're trying to do. Thanks, Anne. I've got 2 minutes there. So within restorative practices, what we're trying to do is build relationships between people and have a positive social climate that makes co-creation more likely. You can see in the picture here, this is an event we had in the Department of Justice where people are physically sitting in circle of chairs, and the right to speak in response to each question revolves around the circle sequentially using a talking piece. So it's quite a structured way of doing things. Each group has a facilitator, and that is meant to, first of all, prioritize a relational approach because you intentionally ask relationship building questions, but also give everyone a chance to respond equally. And so it's a dialogue process where there's a lot of listening and learning and building trust with each other. The second thing that we use, as I say, is the design thinking approach, where we effectively exercises with led by colleagues from the Department of Design Innovation in Maynooth, where you're trying to get people not just to come up with ideas, but to really dwell on what exactly are the problems we're trying to solve, and then be really creative in thinking about what you're going to do to resolve that. Because research translation, how to achieve that is not obvious. Right? It is not obvious how to have more evidence-informed policy and practice because there's so many pressures on policymakers and practitioners, and is a challenge of even, communicating research and pulling out the practical implications and so on. So how do you actually reach people in a way that you could have, a notable effect on the culture of research policy and practice? And just very briefly, I'll show you the agenda. This is in draft now. But we're hoping to publish this shortly, where we came up with 5 action areas to work on over the next couple of years. And that's around sharing Irish and international research findings of policy and practice, building relationships and knowledge between sectors through this Day in the Life program, where researchers will be able to spend a day with justice agencies embedded, not for instrumental purposes of research, but just to learn and understand, and vice versa. So learning more about each other's professions. More kind of bespoke events looking at research translation in very specific contexts, and a couple of other things. But I mean, what I'm hoping is that it's not just that we're going to do these things, is that these things will have a lot of legitimacy and buy-in because of the process that we use, the fair process that we use in order to co-create them. We're hoping to have, a very high level of commitment and kind of goodwill from lots and lots of different people to implement those. So thank you very much for that. I will stop sharing now.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Fran Callahan, and I am the Assistant Librarian with responsibility for digital publishing and data services in MU Library. Today I'll be giving an introduction and overview, hopefully for some of you, a reintroduction and overview of the Irish Qualitative Data Archive, or the IQDA, which is hosted and staffed in Maynooth University Library. But it wasn't always. It was originally born in 2008 and funded by PRTLI funding back in the day when there was lots and lots of money around for research. Unfortunately, something else happened in 2008, which meant there was never any money for research ever again. But never mind, because the IQDA is one of the things that we have and we hold from that funding. It was envisioned by staff in Maynooth University Social Sciences Institute, namely Professor Jane Gray, who we've heard from earlier today, and Dr. Aileen O'Carroll. It is a qualitative data archive. There is a companion archive called the Irish Social Sciences Data Archive, which is for quantitative data, and that is hosted in UCD, also in the library, I believe. But the IQDA is qualitative data, so we've got interview transcripts, recordings, essays, photos, and pictures. I'm not going to describe what qualitative social sciences data is to this audience. The data objects themselves are hosted in the Digital Repository of Ireland, and the DRI is hosted and ran by the Royal Irish Academy. We have a mixture of open and restricted content. Whilst I think it's fair to say that the IQDA is seen as an open science and open scholarship initiative, we're very aware of the fact that in social sciences, qualitative social science data, even when anonymized, can require sensitive handling. And it was moved to MU Library beginning February 2023, and it took a month or two for the transition to effect. But essentially, we've been running it. I say we, it's really my colleague Laura Gallagher in the library who does all the heavy lifting. But we've been running it for about 18 months. This is what it looks like, or rather, this is what it looked like a little while ago. Here's 30 of our collections on IQDA. We currently have 35 collections. And in the 18 months that we've been running it from the library, we've added 9 new collections. We are currently working on a 10th, and we hope to have an 11th by year end. You see quite a spread of collections here. Each one of these files is an individual collection. And you'll see the amount of objects in each of these collections. And also, if you notice in the bottom right-hand corner of each tile, you'll see either a padlock symbol or no padlock symbol, which will reflect the open or restricted nature of each of these collections. Collection number 34 and number 35, the most recent ones, brings me on to future developments. This is so current that when I created this slide set last week on Wednesday, these were future developments. Website archiving was still to come. By Friday morning, the future is now, which sounds like car advertisement. Sorry about that. But yeah, so in website archiving, we've launched this on Friday morning with 2 websites, really ingested at the same time. But of course, one of them had to be before. So that is Restorative Justice from Ian Marder, who we've also just heard from. And the second, very closely followed by the Irish in Europe, which is an initiative of the Arts and Humanities Institute. These are the first websites to be archived into the IQDA, and indeed the first websites to be archived into the DRI. So it's literally the functionality that DRI were rolling out. These 2 websites were essentially the pilot projects. So we're very pleased with that. This is what a website looks like in the DRI. This is a little confusing, so bear with me. This is the DRI website we're looking at here. In the window to the left, so to the top left-hand corner of the DRI website, you'll see an embedded window, which itself is a digital object, which just happens to be, in this instance, a website itself. It's a little confusing. The URL suggests we're looking at restorative-justice.ie. We're not. We're looking at dri.ie. This is just a static digital object that we're looking at. But you can interact with it on DRI. You can interrogate it and use it as a full website. If you prefer to, you can download the object. It will download as a single file, and it's called a web archive file. And that will be a .warc extension, and there's a little piece of software you'll need, but it's all very straightforward. We've all had to play with it. You'll see we have the metadata here, so you get the DRI. We've got some descriptive metadata. We've got funding acknowledgements. We've got the creator down the bottom. And the key thing here to point out is over on the right-hand side we have a site, so we can cite the original data set. So what can the IQDA do for you? Well, we can provide access to your archived data sets hosted on the DRI. Again, it's an open scholarship initiative. So we do live by the open access mantra of as open as possible and as closed as necessary. And we do put equal emphasis on both of those. And we're very cognizant of the fact that particularly with social sciences qualitative data, even when fully anonymized, it can require handling. And we do go to lengths to make sure that for those data sets, that requesters, that we will check their bona fides as social sciences researchers before releasing data sets. And we'll assign a digital object identifier, or data DOI for your data sets. We saw that on the previous example. This is important. It's not just like, the cherry on top or the thing that makes your data set look professional. We see it as key to making your data citable. So in the same way that your open access publications can be cited and should be cited, we see that that's the reward for making your data sets open, is that they can also be cited and that the kudos accruing goes to you. There's we promise long-term preservation of the data. You'll see it's kind of grayed out here because after 15 years working in the digital archiving space, I'm not entirely sure what long-term preservation means, and I don't really know. I don't think anyone else really knows what long-term preservation means. But insofar as we can all agree what long-term preservation means, we can provide that. And to bring your attention down to the logos here at the bottom. On the left hand side, the DRI is the Digital Repository of Ireland. As I said, it's hosted by the Royal Irish Academy. It has been for 10, 15 years. It's well resourced, it's well funded, and it's not going anywhere. And on the bottom right hand corner, we have the Core Trust Seal, which, not to get too technical about it, but it's a kind of a series of tests and assessments that are carried out independently on repositories. It's difficult to achieve, and it just shows a mark of quality in the archive. And we're here to help with the assisting of the ingesting process. There's uploading, metadata, and licensing. I'll talk about that now in the next slide. But I'm aware of the fact that at this point we're pitching this as you can use the IQDA for uploading. So we're pitching it on you as potential uploaders or potential content creators or depositors. I think given the context of Jane's talk earlier, though, it's important to emphasize also the IQDA as to the audience as potential consumers of the rich qualitative data sets that are already in IQDA. Now, finally, what do we need from you? With support from us, because from the very start of the process, when you contact IQDA, we are there to assist and help at all of these steps. There's quite a lot to it, but it's not difficult, and we're there for all of the points along the way. So what do we need? Well, we need your data sets, and we need your permission to deposit them. That's quite obvious. We need your information sheets, your consent forms, all of the supporting documentation that describe what your data set is. We will work with you on deriving the information on the best formats to use, bearing in mind the long-term digital preservation aspects and the file names that make most sense for those objects. We will work with you on the metadata, so the title, description, creators, and keywords. And we can provide security and encryption for the data sets while they are in that process of being ingested. So if you want the data set moved off of your system and onto ours in the interim, before it's anonymized and all of that happens, we can provide safe and secure storage for that period. We can talk to you about your access control, so it can be fully open, it can be fully restricted, or it can be somewhere in between. There's a number of different kind of restrictions we can put on place. And anonymization, we can't and won't anonymize your data. You wouldn't trust us to, and to be honest, we wouldn't trust us to either. But what we can do is help and engage with you in the anonymization process. And then finally, in terms of licensing and reuse, this is all the kind of stuff about if I put a data set up, what can people who download the data set, what can they do with the resulting download? So that's really it. Here's my contact details, and we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you very much.
Oh, there it is. I'm not talking him.
Hey, folks.
Hello.
I guess we'd like to open the discussion up to questions. Are there any comments or observations from any of you out there in cyberspace? Is that where you are? And we'd love to hear from you.
I could ask Fran a question if no one else is coming in.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the archiving of interview data, qualitative interview data. And it would be a real challenge for me, I suppose. But I assume it is something that you have to have in the information sheet and consent form. And so I couldn't retrospectively, obviously, archive interviews that I've already been conducted. Okay, yeah. So what I'm picturing, right, is as I'm describing, and inviting people to participate in research, who I would work with on this, say, for example, prison governors or guards, or indeed, victims of crime or people who have been convicted of crimes, it's already difficult to convince them that this isn't a risk, And if I'm just picturing saying to them, oh, by the way, I'm going to publish the whole transcript, and I'm just picturing that interaction, and I'm sure it could be fine, but Like, are there, yeah, I suppose I'm not sure exactly what my question is, but I mean, can you tell us about times maybe when you've engaged with researchers who maybe had similar concerns to mine and they actually did manage to do this and it was fine?
Yeah, it's a difficult situation, and it's certainly the case that when you're dealing with participants who are, very sensitive and personal stories to tell, I think the best thing you can do is stress that, first of all, it's consent. So they're welcome to say no, that you're not welcome to upload my data. But I think as well then the clincher for you can be then the anonymization of these, and assuring participants that there will be no identifiable information, so that while their stories will still be available in the archive, their identifiable information will all be removed. And secondly, that even with a data set that's fully anonymized in the archive, we can still impose quite a lot of restrictions on what will happen to those data sets. And as I said in my presentation, we will go to quite extraordinary lengths to determine the kind of the bona fides of people who are requesting the data sets. And you can say it can only be a full professor in sociology, and we'll kind of go, okay, we'll try and establish those. And if that's the kind of the gateway to access that you want to put on your data set, well, then we'll work to that.
Yeah, that's really, can I
Yeah,
follow
coming
up?
on
Sorry.
that,
Oh yeah,
actually.
sorry, go on, Jane, sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to, coming in on that, there is quite a lot of research actually suggesting that, so the researchers overestimate participants' concerns about making data available, that when you actually invite people to allow their anonymized data to be made available, overwhelmingly people tend to agree. Also, you talked about, I mean, I'm not suggesting you do this, Ian, but famously Arja Kula in the Finnish Data Archive went back and got retrospective consent from a major study. She actually went back to the original participants and said, well, we didn't ask you this at the time, but what would you think about having the data included in a qualitative data archive? And now they're very pro science in Finland, so a very high percentage of them agreed that they were happy to do so. But I think definitely people they do want their data archived. In my experience in Ireland, they will prefer to have data anonymized, because I always like to ask people, well, would you mind, having depending on the kind of interview it is, in some cases, it might be a professional speaking in their professional capacity. Why shouldn't they be identifiable? But I find that if you do offer people the option of having their data anonymized, they invariably choose it. But sorry, that's kind of an addendum to what Fran was saying. But I think people are more willing to share their information than we tend to assume as researchers, because we're very particular our participants.
Great, thanks. And there's a couple follow-up questions in the chat, which I can just go through if that's okay. So Mark Scully asks, relatedly, is there a danger that increasing expectation of open qualitative data driven by quantitative paradigms will lead to, quote, safer qualitative projects? So I suppose Mark's asking, is there a possible chilling effect? If everyone accepts that the thing will be published in advance, would we ask safer questions, or would people give safer answers? And then there's two more questions, another one of which is linked to this. So maybe I'll give that one first. One from Emily Murphy. On the back of Ian's question, are there international examples of best practice guides for how to go through transcripts and ensure that interview data are anonymized? Maybe Fran, would Fran or Jane want to take either of those, and then I can.
Yeah, there's quite a lot to unpack there, Ian. Sorry. So the first question was around.
So the first question is, will it change the data that we seek or receive?
Yeah, one is expectation that questions are the being reserved responsibility. It's a good question. It's a good question. But I think in what you said about the business text,
Yes.
and you can make it on case, for example.
Sorry for those of you online, just trying to work with Anne on correcting this.
Are we back?
Yes, yeah, that's okay, yeah.
So I guess what I was just saying is you can make a strong case that your data shouldn't be archived because of the sensitivity of the topic that you're researching. So I don't think that the chilling effect should be as serious as we might expect it to be.
And any best practice guides for transcript anonymization?
That I don't know, but it's
Yes, IQDA actually has, it's a bit dated at this stage,
Yeah.
but we did produce a best practice guide to archiving qualitative data that includes guides to anonymization, which we used practices from the UK Data Archive and from the Timescapes Archive to inform our proposals. So there's, yes, is the short answer. On international and local archives, there are lots of examples and worksheets, particularly the UK Data Archive is very good on this actually, about how to anonymize your data and you know how not to over anonymize, which is always the risk. You know, you make it so you're so worried about identification that you make the transcript almost illegible and meaningless.
Mhm.
And on the other hand, you know, making sure that you don't expose sensitive information that might be harmful to the person who contributed the data. But there are, yes, we I guess, well, I'm sure we links and so on that we can provide people.
yeah.
Yeah, and of course, I suppose it's important to remember that all sorts of qualitative data could be archived. Like it doesn't have to be even primary data, but you know, we're working on a project with a bunch of FOIs right now, and it seems that government departments here do not routinely publish the things that are successfully FOI'd. So you could have an archive even of things that have already been, you know, redacted to within an inch of their life, but are absolutely essential for media and academic use in the future. We've got a couple of questions here, if you want me to continue throwing them out, from Alexander Porshnev. He says 2 questions. Do you know, maybe I'll direct these to Dermot. Do you know about any initiatives or grants to motivate researchers to use open data instead of collecting new data? Oh, maybe that's for Jane, actually. And then maybe this one's for Dermot. What do you think can help? Oh, sorry. What do you think about how the openness of data can help with the reproducibility crisis, he says. So yeah, for Jane, is there any initiatives or grants to motivate using open data? And maybe for Dermot, can open data contribute to that, solving that crisis?
Well, I can answer quickly, not that I'm aware of in Ireland, but in the UK they have actually, I am aware that they have. And in the USA, for example, in the iPhones data set, so they regularly promote reuse of their data, and Dermot mentioned prizes, provide awards for, you know, the best article or the best book reusing existing data. So there are incentives internationally, but no direct incentives in the Irish context. And in fact, I'm very curious and hope I can find out through QSA Net what the disposition of Irish research funders is to reusing existing data.
In terms of addressing reproducibility, you would think that having open data would be a step in the right direction because the data is out there. You've got an extra step of transparency, but I would say it doesn't guarantee reproducibility because you often have data that might be shared that isn't in great shape. So it might be findable, but it's not well described in terms of metadata. You get, you know, columns and columns of data with no data dictionary to explain what the columns are. So people are trying to figure things out and they have to go back to the original researchers and so on. So it's definitely a step in the right direction and should, in theory, help, but it doesn't guarantee it.
And I suppose to add one thing then to what Jane said is that I suppose if open data is also secondary data, right? So for example, the health research boards, they have a specific secondary data call, although it's thematic, right? It's only for health stuff. And I suppose it's certainly not specifically for open data, but I presume that open secondary data would not be excluded from that call. One thing I would note about that call, because I did kind of, I did explore that a little bit, is that they do expect you to know a huge amount about the data set before applying. So in that sense, it might even be more conducive to open data than to closed data, because, you know, we had the idea to apply for a project using a certain secondary data set where really we needed to go in and work out what was there and how it could be cleaned up, and then we could find the research questions, you know, but that was no dice, unfortunately. Got another question here in the chat from Miranda, who asks, is there a standard for how data sets should be formatted and what should be included for open data? Are there guides for that? So I suppose the formatting of data to be archived, I guess Miranda means, and then guides, what should be included. I guess that means like metadata and that kind of thing. Maybe Fran might want to come in on that.
Yeah, again, the IQDA have a guide for metadata standards, Dublin Core metadata standards for ingesting data sets into the IQDA.
The ISSDA would have similar guides.
Yeah,
for
yeah.
quantitative data.
Yeah, I think with ISSDA, they have a kind of a more demanding metadata kind of template.
In general, you want your data to be saved in non-proprietary formats.
Mhm.
So, you know, raw text files or CSV files, things like that, and not, you know, things that are like SPSS data files, which are going to run into problems a few years down the line.
Yeah. Open data formats.
So there are plenty of guides, I think, available. You just go, you just need to go on the websites of the Irish Social Science Data Archive or the Irish Qualitative Data Archive, and there are international standards as well.
Yeah.
As you're well aware.
There's no more questions in the chat. Miranda, thanks you for your answers. It strikes me, if I could have one more question, that it strikes me listening to you guys that there's almost, there's a level of information technology skill or knowledge that is required for some of this stuff that, you know, I would have to look up in order to understand some of these things. But is there anything that any of you guys have learned that, you know, is particularly some basic information technology related knowledge, like, you know, file types, this kind of thing, that you think people who want to do open research in qualitative settings might want to know or might need to know?
I think that's one of the reasons why Ian is trying to stress the level of support that we're willing to provide from the very get-go. It is quite technical, and it does require a kind of a certain level of IT knowledge. It does require an appreciation of open file formats and what it looks like to look at a data set that's already uploaded and say, how do I make sense of this? So it's kind of like insight that almost just comes from experience. And again, that's why we're very cognizant of the fact that we need to bring our expertise to the ingestion process.
I mean, I would also say there's more and more acknowledgement. I mean, Dermot, you mentioned that a lot of the resistance to actually implementing open research practices is time consuming, it's expensive. People don't feel that they're getting credit for it. But increasingly, as Fran pointed out, you can get a digital object identifier, you can get a citation for your data set. A lot of, you know, if you're applying for a European grant, for example, you can submit evidence that you've created data sets as part of your track record. So I think more and more, this is being acknowledged as part of the work that researchers do, and hopefully people will feel it's worthwhile. And also perhaps the funders will recognize that, you know, I think funders are very aware that collecting data entails costs, but they may not be quite so aware that, you know, managing data effectively for analysis and ingesting data for open research purposes also entails costs in terms of personnel and time. So it just needs to be built into research projects.
So I think in the Horizon, the most recent Horizon funding, I think they have included an open research data pilot. So there is good plenty of recognition, certainly from that funder, that research data is a costly business, and particularly open research data is a costly business.
I have a question as well. Following the first presentation, I would like to ask how open research or open science can influence the situation of qualitative researchers. So how can it improve their situation? They are sometimes
their research is seen as, I don't know, less valuable or, for example, easier. So there are different challenges that they face. So how could this actually strengthen their position?
I think that's a good question, Maria. I think that one of the problems that the suspicions that people have in terms of replication, it's one thing to go back and try to rerun whatever that SPSS program was, or and re-crunch the data and see if you get the same outputs when you do the analysis. But when it comes to qualitative data, you know, the practice is often just a snippet of a quotation from a particular one interviewee, and you're making the claim, okay, you know, this is a general trend that exists throughout the data. I think the first step is probably making the transcripts available. There is discussion, or there has been discussion, about how would you make your code book available? Would you make the files that are created in this runs into the whole proprietary software issue, but could you make the files, the summaries and memos and codes that you created in the course of analyzing the data available? But certainly by increasing transparency, I think, I mean, I remember when we first started talking about the IQDA, a quantitative researcher in Ireland, saying to me, this is be a game changer for qualitative completely, because the suspicion is always that we're getting away with something. And I think by you know, by being transparent about what we're doing, making our data available. And I suppose with qualitative social science too, the acknowledgement is always somebody else might interpret this transcript differently. We acknowledge that. But if the transcript is available for others to read, then it creates the possibility of a more transparent dialogue. Now, whether or not that would really improve our status and prestige in the discipline, I don't know, Emily, but I hope it would. I'd like to think it would.
I think, can I add, I think that regardless of the methodology, there's often a kind of hidden curriculum about methods. And so by making all of your research objects more transparent, people can see exactly what's being done. So in terms of training the next generation of researchers, they can see step by step what you've actually done. And often those details aren't there in the journal publication or the book. There's lots of stuff left unsaid or that's implicit. And when they have to go through mechanically all of the objects, they can see actually what's really gone on, and that can be really helpful.
And another issue with qualitative data, don't get me started, is that it's incredibly underanalyzed. I mean, the wealth of questions that could be asked of, 30 interview transcripts, let's say their life stories, and the researcher might have, generated maybe half a dozen publications, whatever, based on that, and then moved on to the next project. But the potential for reanalysis, or, combining those life stories with collection, that was generated for another purpose, is really completely, what's the word? It's not realized. And so I think that that's another reason why the data should be archived and made available. But some researchers actually use that as a reason not to archive, because they haven't finished analyzing it yet. And I'm afraid somebody else might get to it before I did. But it's bad scientific practice. I'm sure Dermot will agree. Can I ask one last question? And I know we're running out of time. It's the elephant in the room question. Fran, do you have any sense of how much the data sets are actually, I mean, people may request access, but how much they're accessed and reused in reality?
This just occurred to me as I was walking over here, Jane, so I'm completely unprepared. And what I'd like to do is start to look at the usage and see what kind of analysis we can conduct at the back end of DRI, and what kind of data we can get from DRI in terms of where the data sets are going and who is using them. Of course, the problem with open access is you're not asking questions of who they are. But if we could even get a kind of a geographical spread, it would be useful. And it kind of, even the raw numbers of how much the data sets are being downloaded, that would be useful. But it's certainly a question that has occurred to me.
And I know the UK Data Archive originally asked people if they did publish data studies based on reanalysis, that they would inform the data archives to be able to, connect to those. That would be really interesting to see if that starts to happen in the Irish context. We could go on because there are loads of questions for Dermot as well, but I think we're gone well over our hour. So Thank you, everybody. I feel it weird. I'm supposed to look this way. I keep wanting to look that way. So I might know my way around an anonymization protocol, but I obviously don't know anything about the Zoom. But I would like to thank everybody for participating and contributing. I think it's been a great session. Really enjoyed it myself, and to all of you out there. And I'd like to thank in particular Bao for initiating the session on initiatives, open research initiatives at Maynooth, and to thank Fran and Dermot and Ian for their contributions, and particularly to thank Anne Hamilton Black for setting it up and making it possible to run as a hybrid event. And thanks to all of you for joining us. So hopefully we'll see you again.